And we're live. Hi everyone, this is Gamer, and I hope this will be the one of many tutorials I'll be making for Old World. I'm assuming that when you're watching this, it probably means that you already bought the game. The purpose of the tutorial is to help new players understand better what they're trying to achieve and understand how to get certain yields and stuff. It's not here to convince you whether or not you want to buy this game. I'm sure there are plenty of much better YouTubers who can convince you why you should buy the game. And being part of a tutorial series, I will be covering different aspects, and the first aspect will be helping new players set up. The setup is pretty important because when I first started, it felt overwhelming. There's a lot of things that you will encounter, and if you never played the game, it will be overwhelming with the amount of information. And I hope to clear up certain things so that at least you go in a little less confused, a little more informed, and as a result, you can start enjoying the game and maybe learn from your mistakes and win games on whatever difficulties you want to challenge. So we will go from the main screen, new game, and then you will find leaders. There are currently 7 total leaders, and each leader represents a nation: Assyria, Babylonia, Carthage, Egypt, Greece, Persia, and Rome. Notice I'm not reading the name of the leaders because I'm probably going to butcher some of them because I absolutely butcher names. So you have these 7 nations to play from. And even within the 7 nations, you have a lot of diversity. Now you will see a bio that talks about the leader. Your starting leader. Let me emphasize that. Your starting leader. And you have stats. So each of these leaders have their own bio and have each of their own stats. For someone who has no exposure, the stats will mean very little. And it means very little because if you hover over them, you see a lot of information. I don't know why. Okay, yeah. You have a lot of information. For those of you familiar with 4X's, you might understand some of these things, right? Especially if you play Civilization before, you're like, oh, trapping, slinger, camp, leads to a technology. Alright. But if you have little to no knowledge, none of these really make sense to you, right? You don't know which ones are good, which ones emphasize what kind of play style. Some of the icons, you don't know what they mean. For example, here we have tyranny. Under unlocks new laws, tyranny law plus 10 icon per year. What does that mean? I will cover that in a later video, but for newcomers, that doesn't make sense, right? So how do you decide which civilization, which nation? And I do apologize if I use the term civilization. I play a lot of Civ 5, so that just comes automatically. But which nation you pick is extremely tough because you don't know what you're picking. But what they share in common is the fact that each nations start with the following. They all start with 3 technology, and as you can see with the changing icons, they start with different technologies. And you will know that basically there are different columns, so they'll get 2 technology from the first column and 1 technology from the second column. And then they each have their own unique units. Assyria has the battering ram and siege tower. Babylonia, I'm so used to calling them Babylon, has Akkadian archers and Sumerian archers. And as you can see, they have different unique units. And then finally you have families. Now families is something else altogether. And as you can see, looking at this, you're like, what is going on? I will cover it in a future one, but just know that these families play an important role, and it's a bit more advanced for this. So let's just say, honestly, this early on, I would recommend you to just pick random. Unless you know what you're doing, which I'm assuming when you're watching this and you're a beginner, you might not quite know. Random is probably the best choice because you could look through a lot of these. I looked through a lot of these and I'm like, I get some ideas what they do, but I also don't know what's good and what suits my playstyle. So random is probably not a bad choice. However, the next bit, the map setting, is extremely important. Now for the map setting, you have the default seaside, medium, custom, random map. I personally don't think it's great for a beginner. Seaside, from what I heard, is not the best map for beginners. I tried it. The way it's set up is actually very tough. I mean, if you want a challenge, you can definitely do so. But I would definitely advise you to go to advanced setups. And there are a bunch of things you need, bunch of options you can change, but I will only cover the ones I feel that will be applicable. So you already picked your nations. I picked random, so it shows random. You can still change. Pick your nation when you settle the first city. I didn't even know you had that option. So you have your nation, opponents. If you want an easier game, pick fewer opponents. If you want to learn the different mechanics. Because the more opponents you face, or if you face the normal amount, right? Like on this map, 4 is default. 4 will make it very interesting. It will likely make it challenging to a certain extent. Of course, that depends entirely on your difficulty. But if you want your first game where you're just learning mechanics and not have to worry about war or competing with other civs, fewer opponents is generally better. Because it will give you more room to expand. It will allow you to make more mistakes. Because if there are fewer opponents, it means that you'll have more land. And with more land, odds are you're able to better, or at least hopefully, defend yourself. So one of the changes I will make is have fewer opponents. And the next one, difficulty. So we have the able, the just, the strong, the good, the strong, the great. And when you hover over them, they will show you what you start with, right? You start with X amount of resources, and then all of your cities will generate +1 that, and +7 that, and capital city plus that. Once I start explaining the different yields and different mechanics of the game, this will make more sense. I'm not going to cover that because it will make this video too long, and honestly, it will just confuse people more than not. And then the next one I would change is AI Head Start. So for AI Head Start, picking this will also affect the difficulty. So massive, which is the toughest one, your opponents will start with an average of 7 cities each. They will have that from the very start. And if your map is small, or at least if it just barely fits, then what will end up happening is the AI will probably take up all the space and you have nowhere to settle. Advanced, 5. Established, 3. For beginners, it's best to go for 2. That way the AI isn't that far ahead. Now ideally, over time, the AI will be improved to the point where they could start with 1 city and they'll be very competitive. But for now, fledgling, at least that's the only option I've seen, is probably your best bet. You have fewer opponents and they start with only 2 cities as opposed to 3, 5, or 7. Then you'll be in a decent state. Victory, enable them it doesn't really matter when you first learn it. It will matter once you start learning what you have to do to win. Because then you're like, maybe I want to win points victory, double victory, ambition victory. Keep all of them on so that at least you'll know what you're aiming for and trying to figure out what kind of victory you want. And then we have tribes. This is also an important one. Now, I'm not going to go into details what tribes are, but once again, this is like your opponents. The fewer the tribes, the better. So tribes and barbarians are different. There are tribes and there are barbarians. Barbarians are easier to handle, while tribes are a bit more threatening. They do play a pretty big role. So you definitely want, ideally, have fewer tribes. It means that you have more barbarians. It will give you more options to expand. I will cover this more in a later video. Like I said, this is just setup. I don't want to confuse people. And most importantly, I feel center bias. You should turn it off if you're new. Now, playing at the center, for some it might be exciting. But for those learning the game, it's not fun when you're surrounded by opponents that might want you dead. Or sometimes they might wall you in and you can't expand anymore. I personally feel that for newcomers, it's better not start in the center. Because then you'll be able to have one front, as opposed to fighting your enemies at all fronts. It's just much harder to handle. Now for some people, they might want to try this as a challenge. Definitely go for it. But just note that when you start at the center, you border, well, you're surrounded by all of your opponents. So the odds of you getting attacked by them is that much higher. If that's the sort of game you want to go for, go ahead. But this is definitely one of the settings that you should consider if you don't want it to be too tough. Now everything else I would probably leave as it is. So to summarize, these are the following advanced settings I will advise you to change. Number of opponents. Fewer there are, the easier your experience is. At least give you enough time to learn the mechanics. Difficulty. This is pretty important because this affects what you start with. I don't know if this affects the AI or not, but this is what you're starting with. Okay, I guess this answers it. AI plays at the good. So the AI has this difficulty. This kind of start. And the AI head start determines if they start with more cities than you. And then number of tribes, pretty important. Fewer tribes will make your ability to expand easier. The more tribes there are, the more challenging it is. Once you get comfortable, there's nothing stopping you from increasing the number of tribes. It will make it tougher for expansion, as you will learn, and as I will eventually explain. So once you have all of that set up, and you're like, I think that's good enough, I just want to get into game, start game, and you'll get into the game. And this will be the end of the setup tutorial. Next tutorial I will probably be stuck on the first turn 0, I think. I can't remember if it's turn 0 or turn 1. And I will be talking about various things that you might want to pay attention to when you first start, before you even settle your first city. There's a lot to cover. We will get there, but that will be covered over a number of tutorials. But anyways, thank you everyone for watching. I hope you'll join me on this ride on learning about this actually incredibly fun game. And hopefully you'll learn a few things. And if I made any mistakes, feel free to correct me in the comments. and I will make sure to correct myself in a future video. So this is the end of this video. Thank you everyone for watching, and I hope you have a good one. Bye.